For years, politicians and advocates have been warning that Israel risks becoming an apartheid state if it did this or didn't do that with regard to the rule over Palestinians. The reality, however, as you'll see in this video, is that apartheid is and has been a reality on the ground for many years. The International Criminal Court defines the crime of apartheid as inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systemic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group. For examples, just think of South Africa under apartheid or the Jim Crow South in the US. Now, let's take a closer look at Israeli apartheid. Number 1. Apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territories. The most extreme version of Israeli apartheid exists in the occupied Palestinian territories that have been under illegal and permanent Israeli military control for decades. In the West Bank, Palestinians are literally told by Israeli authorities that they cannot walk down the streets in their own cities because they are not Jewish. The same is true of hundreds of illegal Israeli colonies built on Palestinian land that are off limits to Palestinians, and an extensive network of roads that Palestinians are not allowed to drive on. That's because Palestinians in the West Bank live under Israeli military dictatorship, where they have no voice in the system that rules them, while Jewish Israelis in the very same West Bank have full political rights under Israeli civil law and are allowed to travel freely without the endless restrictions that apply only to Palestinians. And while Jewish Israelis are allowed to build homes in illegal settlements built on Palestinian land, Palestinian homes in Palestinian areas are routinely demolished, and sometimes entire towns are destroyed as part of Israel's ethnic cleansing project. There are even cases when Palestinians are actually thrown out of their homes so Jewish settlers can come and take them over.
It's becoming a familiar scene in East Jerusalem. Jewish settlers taking over a Palestinian home and dumping the furniture in the garden. This is the settlers' strategy. House by house, family by family, they're trying to take over the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. They're doing so with the full cooperation of the Israeli police and the Israeli courts. And it's a pattern that's repeating all over East Jerusalem.
And 80% of water extracted from the occupied Palestinian West Bank is taken by Israel, while Palestinians are left with just 20% of their own water. As for the Gaza Strip, nearly 2 million Palestinians are effectively living in a large open-air prison under Israeli military siege that has brought a life of misery and despair to the Strip, with contaminated drinking water and inadequate food and medical supplies, lacking the freedom to travel in and out of the Gaza Strip without Israeli permission, which is rarely granted. In short, Israel applies a blatantly separate and unequal rule over Palestinians in the occupied territories that perfectly fits the definition of apartheid. Number 2. Apartheid inside Israel. Unlike the millions of Palestinians who live in the occupied territories without rights, Palestinian citizens of Israel are second-class citizens with some rights. Yes, they are allowed to participate in Israeli elections and run for parliament, but there are dozens of laws on the books in Israel that discriminate against Palestinian citizens of the state. When Palestinian members of the Israeli Knesset tried to pass a bill to define Israel as a country of all of its citizens, the Israeli parliament rejected the bill and refused to even bring it up to the floor for debate. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insisted that Israel is a nation not of all of its citizens, but only of the Jewish people. Jewish towns frequently prevent Palestinian citizens of Israel from moving into their neighborhoods, with the support of the Israeli Supreme Court, which upheld the legality of housing admission committees that can reject applicants using the thinly veiled racist criteria of, quote, suitability with the social and cultural fabric of the town. And while there are no restrictions on Jewish spouses of Israelis living inside Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel who marry Palestinians from the occupied territories are barred from living with their spouses. And just like in the occupied territories, there are cases where Palestinian towns inside Israel are destroyed with the explicit purpose of replacing them with Jewish towns. And while any Jewish person anywhere in the world can move to Israel and live there, based on an ancient biblical connection to the land dating thousands of years back, millions of indigenous Palestinians who were driven from their homes by Israeli ethnic cleansing just a few decades ago are denied their right to return to their homes. Still think there's no apartheid?